Thanks, Josh. So good evening, everyone. Thanks to Thales for sponsoring this event, and welcome. I'm looking forward to a really good discussion about the Essential 8. So I thought I would start by giving a bit of background and telling everyone what they are, because everyone forgets. I'll start with a bit of history about how we came to this point, and then I'll kick off with a few introductory questions, and we'll really cover, are they a good recommendation? Talk a bit about the balance between compliance and risk management. Why do they seem to be so hard to implement, and where do we go from here? So that's the broad outline for the evening. So first of all, way back in the day, people were getting compromised by cyber breaches all the time, and ASD made a decision to actually try and rank things and say, what are the best things to do? So this was kind of innovative at the time because they were actually making a call on what was useful, what was really useful. So that was the top 4, and that was back in 2010. So they were application whitelisting, patch applications, patch operating systems, and minimize administrative privileges. So these are the top 4. And at the time, ASD, well, DSD back then, said that just implementing those 4 steps would mitigate 85% of, they call them targeted intrusions. So 85% seems pretty good, but it still leaves 15%. So we can talk a bit later about the story there. In April 2013, the government Protective Security Policy Framework made the top 4 mandatory for government agencies, and they had a July 2014 implementation date. So in retrospect, that seems outrageously optimistic. In 2017, ASD had an Essential 8. So the Essential 8 are application whitelisting, patch applications, configure Microsoft Office macro settings, application hardening, restrict administrative privileges, patch operating systems, multi-factor authentication, and daily backups. So the top 8, or the Essential 8, actually come out of this list here, which has 37 different mitigation strategies. So we're picking what they think the best 8 are. So I really actually do like this list, and partly, or in fact mostly, because of this these columns on the right, which talk about whether something will face user resistance, i.e. it's a real embuggerance, how much it costs to implement, and the ongoing maintenance costs. So it allows organisations to actually try and make decisions about where they want to invest their limited resources. So for example, one of the high cost, high maintenance, high potential user resistance mitigations is personnel vetting. So they think it's a very good mitigation, but it's very expensive. And they rank all the different mitigations they've got, and I think it's a really useful matrix to think about. We've had a number of audits looking at cybersecurity in the government departments, and the Australian National Audit Office has audited over time, the last several years, 14 organisations, and only ever 4 have actually implemented the top 4. So 4 out of 14 isn't a particularly good track record, keeping in mind it's now 2018 and the target was 2014. One of the really interesting things I came across is that the audit office had itself been audited, and that audit found that the ANAO thought they were implementing the top 4, but in fact were not. And so they've since corrected that, but I think it just goes to show it's not as easy perhaps as people might think. So that's the background on how we've gotten to the Essential 8, starting with the top 4. It is apparent it's not as easy as it looks. So I'll now start with just some introductory getting to know you questions. So Rachael, my background's in biology, and we used to deal with cooperative research centres. But what's the role of the CRC, the Cooperative Research Centre, in cybersecurity? Where do you fit in the landscape?
It's a good question. Where we fit in the landscape is a cooperative research centre is, we have government and we have Commonwealth money along with industry money and academic money, and we're about research with impact. So cybersecurity research with impact. So we have 7 years of funding, but we're about funding a whole bunch of industry related, hopefully, research. That will be some short-term and some long-term. So cooperative research centres since their existence have really come and have had some incredible achievements over the years. So we're about having some real impact on hopefully our sovereign capability in cybersecurity, as well as building Australia's cybersecurity pipeline for building students who go on to be cybersecurity professionals.
Okay, great. Now, Ross, I was really intrigued by your title, which was Virtual CISO. What does that mean?
It means, look, I can be in many places at one time. I'm not really here. This is what, no. What it means is really I'm the customer-facing head of security from a Thales perspective. So we have an internal chief security officer, Ben, who looks after Thales's operations within Australia and New Zealand. I'm really here to help customers on that cybersecurity journey from a risk perspective, help them understand what the challenges are, what they need to do, but move it away from a technologies discussion to a board-focused, risk-focused discussion.
Right, okay. I'll pick up on that note later. So Martin, final getting to know you question. Why do we have companies that provide security services? I'm trying to see what's different compared to, say, like other industries where you don't have security as a separate industry to the, say, the automobile industry or something like that. How does that all fit in?
Well, you say the automobile industry. The automobile industry have aftermarket products. There's a whole industry that springs around that. I think the reason you've got a security industry is because the majority of people in this room and industry, security isn't their business. The technology is an enabler for them to do business, and security is I guess, a supporting service. So you need security businesses to provide that expertise, and also that view from different perspectives. Because if you only work in the public service, you only get the public service perspective. So I think that's where security companies can provide a real expertise and a very, I guess, unique perspective.
Okay, so let's get to the heart of the matter. Is the Essential 8 any good? Do we like it? Do we hate it? Do we think it's got problems? Let's start with you, Rachael.
Absolutely. I think the Essential 8 is good. I think leaving aside the fact people may not have implemented it, it still stands the time of great guidance. I think the problem is we love numbers in cybersecurity. We've got the Essential 8, we had the top 4. The problem is the reason it's so hard to get cut through is most organisations go for the 3 distractions, which are AI, robotics and machine learning. So my view is don't spend $1 on the 3 distractions until you've spent your money on getting your cybersecurity posture right.
Yeah, so there's 37 on this one, and not one of them is AI or machine learning.
Yeah, but that doesn't. But the amount of organisations I've spoken to in my career who I bet haven't got their shop in order, but spend a lot of time talking about robotics, AI, or machine learning.
Ross, do you agree, disagree? I won't ask you if Thales has implemented the Essential 8.
Look, it gets back to basics. I think there is, as Rachael highlights, there's a lot of talk about a lot of wonderful flashy things in the pan, but at the end of the day, it's getting back to basic hygiene. And I think time and time again it's been proven that, as ASD have highlighted, if you do the basics, it stops a lot of the problems happening. And the other part to that too, I guess just to extend it, is it's about visibility, day-to-day visibility for a business. Just as a business would normally get visibility of their finance, how their ICT infrastructure runs, so too we need to get a good view on cyber health for a business. A lot of places still don't have that quite right yet.
Martin?
No, I absolutely agree. It's, I think we're talking fundamentals here. You know, as businesses go through that digital transformation, they introduce additional risk into their organisation, and I think that the Essential 8 are helping to actually manage that risk, at least mitigate part of the risk, and I think it's a really good baseline, and that's really what we're talking about here. The 8 are, or the 4 are a baseline. that organisations need to understand. But importantly, it's pinning a framework around cybersecurity, because cybersecurity can be quite intangible. You know, how do you put a price on that? How do you actually how do you measure it? And I think by having the framework, it gives you something that you can actually anchor to. You've got the maturity models, which show your progression as you go through that. So I think it's actually fundamental.
So I ran into a friend recently who worked at ASD around the time that the top 4 was mandated. And surprisingly, he said to me that they had actually argued against the top 4 being made compulsory in government. And his reasoning was that at the time, you make something compulsory and it prevents the people on the front line actually making a risk management decision about whether to implement something or not. So I must implement whitelisting. That means that I have another control that perhaps would be quite good, but I can't get to it because I've got to do this. And I want to have a discussion about compliance versus risk management. So is it better, and I've always thought the compliance is better than nothing, but not much better than nothing, whereas really understanding what your risks are and making decisions based on your risks is better, but it's a lot harder to get people to understand their risks in the first place. So Rachael, do you have views on that?
Yeah. I think you can't know the risk, your cybersecurity risk, until you have gone through a thorough process, and it may not be the top 4 Essential 8, but you can't, no board could understand their cybersecurity risk or what good looks like if they haven't gone through a process. I think we've got to be careful here. Compliance does not equal security. I think that's the risk everyone thinks it is. Doing a proper analysis and taking an organisation through, even if it's Essential 8 or 4 or 5 or 7, your favourite number, it gives the board a baseline upon which they can grow. Essential 8 won't be ideal for every organisation because listed companies and others will want more. But I think it is important because you can't understand the risk and take a strategic view as a board until you go and you look your CISO and the IRA, whoever it is, and say, okay, where do we sit with these elements? So the board, as Martin pointed out, the board's got to have some framework. But I often see these exercises reduced to tick and flick. Similarly, when the ASIC health check came out, you know, once you get it into groups and it doesn't always stay at the board level, it will go right down to a compliance function. It becomes an Excel spreadsheet exercise, and it's all about getting it through the various cascading committees in an organisation to get it up for sign-off. I think the thing organisations need to understand that in the event of a breach, that's when your lawyers will start to unpack what you have and really meaningfully get to the nub of your cybersecurity issues. And I've seen it where then when the beads of sweat on people's faces sort of because then they realise they are going to have to do affidavits, they are going to be in witness boxes, they are going to have to face their board or scrutiny, certainly external scrutiny. And then it becomes really clear what is cyber window dressing, what is tick and flick, and what are true operational risks that they have minimised because they've implemented something like the top 8 or the 4 or 35 or whatever it is, that they actually have driven actual security through their organisation. And it becomes a cultural thing, but it board down, and board has to understand the risk that comes from there.
So Ross, you're in the position of actually being one of those people who's trying to drive security culture. How's that going?
Great.
So let me, another story. A friend of mine is a CISO, and he said it's the worst job in the world because people want to do things that you have to tell them no. Do you find it the worst job?
No. And the reason being is I've learnt over the years. I started out as a technologist, and it was very much a black and white world, and you worked with widgets. The further you move into different management roles and things, the more you appreciate and understand the day-to-day operations and health of a business, whether that be finance, workplace health and safety, and you start seeing that cybersecurity is just another risk lens on the business. And for, I think, many years, we've actually focused on technical controls equals, as Rachael said, we're secure, we're okay. These days, boards are much more aware of their obligations. We've seen breaches in the last few years where we've talked about that hypothetically in the past. People are now being held accountable front and centre with the beads of sweat rolling down their face to say, you need to deal with the consequences of this. So there's an element of it's a good time to be here, but we still have a long journey to go. What we found is that boards are now switched onto this. They're getting trained and aware because they're sitting on other boards. They're aware of what that risk means. The challenge then for those organisations is typically the executive teams and the security managers and sizes underneath that are trying to play catch up to actually get up to the level of understanding and awareness that boards will typically ask. They'll ask a question, and as Rachael said, it'll go management by committee, and there'll be an obscure answer that comes back that doesn't actually necessarily give a lot of boards confidence. That's, I think, where we're at the moment, and I think in terms of where to go, we've got another couple of years before we really start unpicking what cybersecurity as a risk really means. I think we've seen some good work in that space. I think people tend to think sometimes that maturity equals security as well, or that in some ways that we can outsource security to someone else. But again, through third-party suppliers, we're still accountable for that risk.
I was going to ask Martin, a couple of people in the InfoSec industry have said to me that we really need regulation because they don't, this was perhaps a year or two ago, they hadn't seen themselves getting enough traction and that they thought the state of cybersecurity was generally poor. Do you think that that's changing? Would you agree? And also just your comments on the compliance versus...
I was going to say, what, define traction, not enough sales? You know, because
I think
if
that,
you're saying from the InfoSec industry.
yeah, exactly. That could be part of it.
Yeah,
so I'm looking for an honest assessment here.
Well, I was just picking up from what you were saying, Rachael, about the, you know, you talked about the agencies or the organisations that are implementing the Essential 8 from a compliance perspective. I think there's two pieces there. One, compliance suggests that you're doing it not through choice and to manage risk, but you're doing it just to tick that box. And if you think about the way the ANAO approach it, I'm not bagging the ANAO, but they are measuring your compliance against the controls, but not putting it into perspective in terms of the risk in your organisation. And the expectation is that you roll out the controls across your whole organisation. Now, if you're managing risk, the controls may be very pertinent to certain parts of your business, but not all of them. And you know, when you think about just the basics of patching, you'll have patching cycles, but you need to be able to mitigate why you're not going to roll out a particular patch within 48 hours. But as long as you've got a strategy and I guess a risk management process to do that, you're becoming more cyber resilient, but you're not compliant. So there is that trade-off between are you being compliant or are you being cyber resilient? And I think that's where we could probably do some work and reach out to our friends at the ACSC in terms of providing more guidance to organisations that it's not just about compliance, it's about building your resilience, and there's several ways to skin a cat, so to speak.
Yeah, so I've noticed the word cyber resilience appear a lot in the kind of conversations in the last year or so. Why are we using that word? Why are we not talking about cybersecurity? Martin, you brought it up, so I'll put you on the spot.
Well, I guess it is about, the reason I think it's resilience, because you're never going to mitigate 100% of those risks. Those risks at some point will always come to the front. There will be a breach of some sort. So it is about building up your resilience, but you're never going to completely mitigate those risks. So I think that's why the term has been used.
Okay, that's great, because I was wondering about the 85%. 85% still leaves 15%. 15% doesn't seem small necessarily. So I think we've had a really good discussion about whether they are effective or not. We've talked a bit about management, risk management versus compliance. But I wanted to talk also about why do they seem like they're just so bloody hard? Why can, sort of 25% of organisations implement them?
I think to me it comes back to probably a lot of things. Some, and I can't speak on government departments, but generally why programs struggle is budgetary costs. Sometimes it's the dashboards and distractions. Again, we've got something we're chasing over here that looks far more interesting. It can be simply the grind. My experience is sometimes you may want to roll out a particular risk strategy or a security strategy will work, but there will always be in an organisation a small amount of detractors who will not want to implement that security. They will try their hardest to not get it implemented on their end point because they know better. They're the sort of IT renegades in organisations who really want to show the IT department how it really should work. They exist in organisations. And sometimes it's the human factor. Don't forget, the best security strategies in the world can be undone by someone clicking on a really sophisticated fish. So you can have a brilliant, with a 0 day or something that's very unique that hasn't been seen before. And I also think there is an element of wanting to dazzle boards. There's still, as I say, the dashboards and distractions. I'm just stunned that people still love the glove puppetry of great new exciting things they've seen, and they come back with it. And rather than the boring trudgery of getting on with, there's no glamour in trying to implement the essential 8. It is trudge, people fight you, there's no glamour. But unless you're building a narrative around, we're doing this because we know that if we do X, it'll drive down this risk. And this means it's great for our customers or great for our people. It's great because we make sure that our customers know we're trusted. So often people fail to, in my experience, build narratives around it and build it out and tell their entire workforce. This might seem like a hassle, but we're doing it because our customers trust us with their data. So it all has to come back to a story, and a story about why you hold that valuable data in the first place. Absent that, it is a bit like, oh God, security are getting us to do this again, and the no police, and they're stopping me from running my favourite hacked, or my favourite something I've downloaded I can't run, and it becomes that, or they're watching us. But there's all reasons for that, because often we know that customer data or secure or very confidential data is at risk if it isn't protected. So it's building a narrative, and often that just takes time, workforce, energy, and again, dashboards and distractions. They'll always kind of be there.
When I first started at Defence, there was a goal to get everyone to use Microsoft Outlook, and the goal was in a year's time. And 16 years later, when I left, there were still people not using Outlook. And now that you mention it, I never did hear the narrative of why we all needed to use Outlook. Anyway, Ross.
No, it does. It really comes back to the basics of the why. The why should we care, and it's the so what message, isn't it? It's what's in it for me, for each of the employees in the workforce. We often find that people say, here's a mandate and you need to do it. How often do we get the people, the detractors, and the other people that just say, you're not going to do it? If you explain why, there's a lot of very reasonable people in the workforce. And we do find, the most important part of any of these cyber security changes, risk is culture, isn't it? So it doesn't matter how many smarts and technological things you put in place, at the end of the day, that can all be undone in a second by someone clicking on a link. I've been involved in a couple of incident handling cases over the many years around all of those wonderful things being put in place. Critical infrastructure providers spending lots and lots and lots of money, but a CFO or someone else clicking on a link because they thought, that was the best thing to do.
So Martin, I'm hoping you'll say it's not all about culture, but there's some really hard technical problems as well.
Culture comes from the top in the business. These are technical controls. The top four in particular, it's a technical response that you need, but it's a cultural imperative to drive that forward. That needs to come from the top of the business in terms of why are we doing this? Why is this important? And this is how I'm going to measure it and actually understand exactly what the control is. And the good thing about the Essential 8 is they are technical controls, but they can be understood by the boardroom and people in the server room. You both need to understand it from your perspective. And I think that the difficulty is there still isn't that imperative and that push from the top of the organisation to actually embrace these controls, embrace cybersecurity, and actually drive that through the business. It's coming, but it's a bit like health and safety. I'm sure you've heard the comparison before. Health and safety 50, 60 years ago was it was on the tip of people's thinking, but it wasn't front and centre. Now when you go to a work site, there's a toolbox talk every single day. We'll get to that, but it will take time.
What about one of the examples that's often brought up in these discussions is the $1 million MRI machine in a hospital that runs a version of Windows XP, and it's kind of orphaned hardware and software because the actual device is so expensive. What's the solution there?
I don't think there's a solution. I think there's a number of ways in which you can mitigate that risk. People tend to just typically focus on the technical aspect. Yes, you can put technical controls around it. Yes, the Essential 8 is great to start solving that problem. But I think it's a broader problem that not only health has, critical infrastructure has, universities running old photocopiers that have the same problems. But also on a broader scale these days, we have people at home using consumer devices, the Internet of Things. We have things that people don't want to spend a lot of money on but want to connect and get personal benefit from. It's always going to be a mixture of plugging the basic gaps and doing the brilliant basics. They're boring, yes, they're basic, yes, they're annoying, yes, they cost money, but they're there for a reason.
Okay, so what I've heard from this part is that risk management's good, essential eight's pretty good. What we really need is the cultural change that places cybersecurity in the same place that health and safety is. Yep. So now, what's next? So we think they're good. What do we do? How do we drive further implementation in government and business and in schools, all these places?
I think one way, an effective way, is and I think the ACSC are doing this, and I think governments are becoming more open, is talk about the exposure when you haven't got effective security strategies. And so today in the AFR there was an article again about nation states and potential theft of IP. The US has had the dialogue about IP theft and nation states and commercial espionage for 10 years now. They've been running it. I think in Australia we have danced around it a little bit. It certainly came out in the 2016 US presidential election, and certainly around foreign interference. And I think that is just showing that cyber is a conduit for a lot of things, and being open, it's a conduit for theft, commercial espionage, interference, and hacking, defacement. So it's a conduit that can cause great harm quickly. And I think if we have agencies being more open about that, and we obviously had the Director General of ASD speak very publicly a couple of weeks ago, we have more open dialogue around just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not happening. And so just because you can't see the threat and you haven't got your intellectual property secured, and universities are an important issue here, intellectual property needs to be protected at every level, and let's start having an open dialogue. I think people are getting a little tired of the nothing to see here. There was no data to. I am getting a little. I love the media releases that come out with where there has been an incident, but there's no evidence that data was stolen. And now I go, really? Because you want to get to a situation where you can identify. Now that may be the case, and no data has been stolen. But I think it's important that don't let them in the first place, and we need to start having that conversation. And I think you're right, boards are changing, boards realise their targets, but it's really important that every organisation, from ASX-listed companies right through to universities and schools, individuals, understand that all data has value, and if it's of value, it will be of value to third parties irrespective of what their motivation is. So it's keeping it in the public eye, but it's keeping it that, some organisations and nation states have a rapacious appetite for intellectual property and for stealing secrets, and it's important that you just protect where you can.
Yeah, so I'm always also super cynical about those announcements that there is no evidence that your data is stolen, because we never collected the logs so that we could tell.
Yeah, we never had the logs anyway that told us.
So, Martin, what do you think's next?
I think the framework of the Essential Eight, I think that will become more front and centre for us, both in government and in commercial, because in government there tends to be the imperative to get things done tends to be done by either compliance or regulation. But in business, it tends to be driven by economics. And so unless there's regulation put in place, such as notable data breaches, it will come from insurance. The insurance brokers will start demanding what evidence can you give us that you're increasing your cyber posture. And I think that what will happen is that they will need a framework to anchor that too. And I see the ASD Essential 8 or the top 4 as a framework that the insurance brokers can start looking at to put that commercial imperative on commercial organisations.
As long as the insurance brokers are also protecting all that information they store about everyone's cyber security posture. Because if I was also wanting to look at something, that's where I go.
Absolutely. And I think at the moment the Australian Energy Market Operator is doing a very similar exercise using the American Council's cyber maturity model. Same thing, it's gathering a lot of great data about some very important assets in Australia. Again, we've got to get back to, I think the basis of what we're all talking about here is putting a very tangible value on information. the intellectual property that sits behind the business, and the business stopping and thinking about that for a little while, rather than just going, well, you know, for example, we've got old clunky IT systems sitting in the background. I've got an ability to go and buy a cloud service that's sexy, that looks great, and I can get my job done a lot quicker. It's those stop and think questions, and tying it back to the safety culture of a business. It's tying it back to having that real discussion, the hard discussion about the predominant risk culture of a business. In critical infrastructure and other places, it's safety. In banks, it's typically that operating risk discussion. So how do we tie cyber into those risk discussions and actually make it part of people's job descriptions, part of their accountability to actually help the business manage that risk?
So one of the news articles today was that the Chinese Ministry of State Security, the allegation at least, is that they had been compromising managed service providers. So managed service providers are basically companies that run other companies' IT on a contract. And we had a discussion about this just before, and it seems to fit quite nicely into talking about the Essential 8. So ASD actually has a series of questions to ask managed service providers. And to me, they seem like just slightly a bit lame. And it's mostly because of what you said, Martin, which is that you can outsource your IT, but you can't outsource your risk.
Absolutely. Yeah. You outsource the physical service, but you still own the risk as the business. And so you need to make sure that your supply chain, whether they be managed service providers or widget providers, actually can give you that comfort that they've got a risk mitigation strategy in place for their side as well, because it's the one potential vector for people to get in.
Yeah, so I mean, to be fair, these questions are directly trying to get at whether your managed service provider takes risks seriously. I guess I'm cynical because you employ an MSP to cut costs, basically, is my view. Ross, would you agree with that?
It's one of the drivers. So sometimes it is that a business doesn't have that skill or expertise, and so they'll try and hire that in because it is actually a risk for them to try and run that. But yeah, for me, it is, you can outsource responsibility, but you can't outsource accountability. At the end of the day, you as a business and the leadership team there need to be accountable for asking those right basic questions of each of the suppliers through the supply chain. And what we've also found in the years gone by as well is just the extent though of that supply chain sometimes. Although you might ask the first vendor and they might provide you an end-to-end service, they hire third parties who hire third parties. How do you, through that entire supply chain, properly manage that business risk? In many ways we get back to the basics, and it's treat that outsourced provider like a business unit. Set expectations, set the outcomes, set service levels, set performance indicators, and manage them accordingly.
So Rachael, one of the pieces of work I know you were involved in and co-authored was the 5 No's, which is, I think it's a Telstra thing, right? And it seems to be approaching the problem at a totally different level, but sort of in a way vaguely complementary. Did you want to have a quick spiel about it?
So Mike Burgess and I co-authored the 5 No's, that's KNOWS, not no's, of cybersecurity, because we wanted to take the discussion of cybersecurity from being a tech one into something where we could talk to the board and senior management about understanding cybersecurity risk in their business unit. And they basically are know the value of your data, know who has access to that data, know where that data is across the world, know who's protecting the data, and know how well it's protected. And we rolled that out to each business unit and asked each head of the business at Telstra so that they could run through really those 5 with their top team. And really know the value of your data wasn't so much a monetary value at the time, it was what data would you lose that would cause the organisation pain? And invariably it didn't come down to much, there wasn't a lot, but it really started to take the conversation to one where we could engage on a normal non-tech level and get people to understand the risks involved in the data. And it was a good piece of guidance that sort of lasted many years at Telstra and beyond around really getting people to understand the tracking of that data from sort of its, if you like, its creation right through the organisation and through, as you mentioned, the outsourcing chain. And then it helped us when we started to frame data security requirements for third parties, because then we really wanted to know, well, if you're looking after X valuable information, how well are you going to look after it for us? And you're absolutely right. I did another project in my past life around how many organisations had sensitive data, and that wasn't so much the scary bit, it was how many had subcontracted, and we were unaware of that. And I think that's the scary thing. So really inculcating in everyone in a supply chain, whether it be the 5 no's or what your obligations are, to take those seriously, because under the Privacy Act, certainly in Australia, that risk vests with the organisation back here. And it doesn't matter even if you've got, like you might be a large offshore organisation, if you've got a presence here, you're still bound by the Privacy Act. So you're accountable for the acts of offshore suppliers. So the 5 no's was a great way to have a normal human being English discussion about cybersecurity, because when I first came into cybersecurity 6.5 years ago, everyone would just talk to you in product names and bamboozle you and throw all these technical words. And I remember just staring at people and not understanding. And then you could see seniors doing the same thing, going, "Oh, I don't understand," but all you're doing is saying names and asking for more money. So we wanted to reduce it to something that was practical, tangible, they could walk away with it, and they could actually, again, getting back to my original point, assess the risk of the cybersecurity risk for their part of the business and what that meant, and then take tangible measures to secure where they deemed the highest risk. Because you're absolutely right, you can't lock down everything, but if you know you've got internet-facing systems with valuable data, well, you're going to focus some of your attention on minimising that risk. It's risk minimisation and effectively managing this risk, and that's why we had the 5 no's, to really help everyone effectively manage the risk.
Great. So we now have time for questions and hopefully answers. So if anyone has a question, feel free to stick up your hand. Otherwise, I will continue to ask questions until canapes.
Yeah.
Sorry, someone somewhere?
Focus, Gay. I go with Gay first.
Gay.
Thank you. Quelle surprise. Fabulous presentation, and thank you, ASPI, and to Thales and to Huntsman for presenting tonight. It's a question for all of you. How, given the fact that we don't have majority of audited government agencies compliant with those mandated standards, how does the Australian government, how does the Australian Parliament, and how do the Australian people know if their government agencies are cyber resilient, cyber secure? How do we provide them with a level of assurance that things are okay, given the fact that these agencies are holding data about them and a lot of it is very personal?
Do you want to start?
Simple question. I think we need, in some ways, to get back to the basics. I think if, at the moment, maybe we don't know completely. I think we know partly. I think we know that there are problems, and I think people are asking the natural questions. So what about my data? My health at the moment is a very good example of that. I'm still asking the same questions myself. I think what would give us as consumers a lot more confidence is if we were to talk about having that transparent discussion to say, here are the basic things that we should be having in place as a government for the government doing their own risk assessment, saying, here are the most important bits of information that we hold on behalf of Australia. Let's put more of our eggs into those baskets to start looking at better ways of protecting that and starting that journey from there. For me, in many ways, it's following what we would normally do with a business. It's not the easiest answer, it's not the quickest answer, but I think it would probably give us all a lot more confidence.
I'd give a shorter answer. It is about measurement. Because if you can measure something, you can actually improve it, or at least begin to understand it and then exert some influence on it. And we've been sitting here talking about a set of controls which are actually very measurable. Now, whether you are 100% compliant or 50% compliant, unless you measure it, you don't know, and you're blind to the risks. So I think from my perspective, to give real confidence and comfort that organisations, whether they're agencies or organisations, are cyber resilient, and so you need to have some level of measurement. And I say it's not just about hitting the compliance. You need to have visibility.
And I'd like to think that they're actually availing themselves of help that they could be getting, those who are struggling, from ASD or ACSC, because they've been more open about, we will help you, we are here. but I'd like to think that they are availing themselves of that. I think since the census, e-census sort of e-fail or whatever we describe it as, I think you've not only seen citizens becoming more aware, but there is more of a focus on government departments, and there can't be obligations on listed companies and everyone else. There should be equal obligations on government departments. So I think whilst it may be hard, I'd like to think they could avail themselves of help that is readily available.
Yeah, you can.
Thank you. I'm wondering, how much work do you guys do with law firms? Because that's another area where, of course, you have lots of information that's supposed to be kept secret. I'll be honest, I've worked at quite a few small firms and medium firms that I felt were not up to stuff, and one of them actually got hacked, and luckily they were able to get all the information and everything. But it would seem law firms are also having an issue with upgrading their security and also getting up to date with where things are. And at the end of the day, with them, it's more of a business, so it's more of a cost-benefit analysis. And I think that's how most businesses, even the government, looks at it, is more of a, well, what's the cost-benefit out of this? Will it fit budget, et cetera? So I'm just wondering, instead of, not forcing people, but coming through saying you have to follow through these 8 no matter what, instead of that saying, okay, if you follow through with this, we'll give you this, kind of like a carrot and stick approach, rather than we'll give you this and just expect you to do this. It's kind of like looking at tax cuts too, expecting we'll give you money and expect you to do, the right thing, when really whenever any of us is handed something free, we'll usually just take it for ourselves, unfortunately. So have you worked with law firms at all, and what is your opinion?
Well, I was a lawyer for 15 years. I didn't work with the law firm in doing cybersecurity, but lawyers get confidentiality, because confidentiality is a key limb of legal professional privilege, so they absolutely understand that. And certainly the big firms that I've worked with in the past do understand cybersecurity and get it. They want to, because they've also got a competing interest. A lot of them have practices in cybersecurity. So it's a bit like you can't have one practice helping clients and on the other hand you're not cyber secure. So they do get it, and a lot of Australia's top firms are certainly working towards some sort of form of ISO compliance or the other thing. But again, like any other organisation, they too can't get distracted on just having wanting to be compliant with their favourite standard without actually making sure they've got operational standards. It has come for some law firms that it may be a struggle. I'm not sure why, but lawyers certainly understand the confidentiality is key to their business. So they would have an incentive beyond any government incentive, and I'm not sure that's the way to go. They would have a business incentive to have confidentiality as paramount for their firms.
Yeah, I really can't add to that, to be honest. That's, it's like any industry.
Yeah.
There needs to be, you need to understand, I guess, what is your business and what are the business imperatives, and then look at the enablers. So digital transformation in the legal profession is the same as any other organisation or any other profession. It's about how you adopt that digital transformation and how you manage the risks that brings with it.
Yeah. They're on top of it. I think many I've seen are working on it and are deeply engaged with it on some levels. I can't comment as to the cybersecurity posture of many of them, but the ones I've seen, very committed to making sure they do the right thing.
Was it Andrew? Did you have a...
Andrew McBride from PwC. Actually, Martin's last comment there fed into my question about how do we move to security being an enabler and getting rid of the no police and mentality, because in my experience working with government departments, the IT department is not necessarily the most responsive business unit to business needs. And they often go, oh, no, we can't do that because security said we can't do that. How do we make cybersecurity a business enabler, like adoption of cloud computing technologies, for example?
Can I take that one on notice?
I think part of it is comes back to Rachel's point about having simple questions and simple answers. You know, getting away from being that handbrake to happiness. That people will find the simplest way to do something, as you're highlighting. And if we make security simpler, if we try and, what we talk about, putting security into day-to-day practice. So if you're running a project, what are the basic things that should be covered? How do you do basic risk assessments within projects? How do you value information at a very, very, very simple level? Don't start with all these great detailed checklists, because that's the quickest way to get people to avoid you. So for me, it's about trying to bake it into the basic process. Look at the highest risk areas. Like if you're doing digital transformation, people are trying to avoid you and move out into cloud services. How do you bring them back into the fold and actually start helping and add value?
I think it comes from the top too. I think it's important for heads of agencies or any organisation. It comes from them saying this is important, and it can't just be for IT to say no, 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 or blame security. It's around, please tell people if they ring up, tell them why they can't run their favourite game, tell them why they can't install a key cracker, and tell them why they can't download their favourite and pirated software. And these are the reasons, because it compromises our systems. It puts, if anything free comes with often free malware, tell them why, so that they understand that. And otherwise, to me, it's again that, because it's easier just to say no and blame security or whatever, have a stop. But that comes from the top. That can only come from CEOs and heads of agencies or organisations saying, we need to explain to our people why we're doing this. We can't just simply give them no and tell them they must do it, or do changes or make them do updates that interfere with their work. It's about that. It's understanding, and it's certainly when there are big upgrades for, in my experience, and it may impact the workforce or them do it at a time when it's actually convenient and won't fall over, and explain why you're doing things. A little bit of a story goes a long way, and an engagement. You'll always get, sure, there'll be the odd, no, you can't for hard reasons do this. But again, I know when I've been in previous roles, when we've put out stories, and I don't mean, we put out narratives around why you shouldn't take this as back in the time where you couldn't do so much endpoint protection. If you're going to take your laptop from work home and do surfing or online shopping, and you're just taking your cable from home, you won't have the protections of being on back then on the home, on the corporate network. We found that there was a rise in viruses once Monday morning came along. So we wrote a story around why is my computer sick on a Monday, or I don't like Mondays, or something like that. And it was about the fact that that spiked because people were essentially taking a protected laptop and then going home. And so we got the number down by people going, oh, I never thought of that. So just building a story around it, so making it easier, because people were getting really angry when IT security ring and say, you've got to do a rebuild. So we made a story around why it's best not to do that. And then we saw the numbers go down, but it was all about helping people understand it. And people don't adopt things quickly. It's 12 to 24 months before you even see a slight change in behaviour. So understanding the arc is not quick.
Fergus?
Sure, thanks for that. It's Fergus from ASPI. I was just wondering, when you drive around town here, you see lots of different security profiles for the different government buildings, but it doesn't seem to match up when it comes to cybersecurity spend. So I guess I wanted to just sort of question about this. Is it just a leadership thing, or is there other reasons behind this? Because two examples really strike me. One is we've just had the AEC achieve the new budgetary funding to replace its 30-year-old computers. We've got some of the examples of the companies that fail, the departments that failed their audit were, for example, the National Archives, which has all of the government's information, like everything. Why is it that we don't have the same sort of security profile for the most important assets that we've got in government when we can deal with the physical things so easily?
Well, I think the physical security has been around for a long time. People get physical security because you can see it, and I think it's bringing it into, it's keeping up with that digital transformation, and the digital transformation will always lead, and effectively the security will follow, and it's trying to get the the agencies and the business leaders actually managing it at the same pace. And you're always going to be behind the 8 ball, I think, in that respect, because the digital security will not keep up with the pace of digital transformation, and you can't see it. It's not tangible.
I think it comes back to the basic narrative again, as Rachael was describing. You know, with physical security, it's very simple and very real and very tangible for people. They can sort of see it, feel it, and understand it, and very easily understand the consequence. They can relate to it back at home as well, very easily. In order to change that culture, again, it comes from the top, but also too, I think it's about making it very, very real for people day to day. So coming back to the what's in it for me, how do we tie it back to the people in the workforce? How do we incentivise and also, you know, put some harder targets for some of these organisations that actually do protect information that is relevant to the business, and how does the government drive that risk-based approach from the top down?
And I think also budget and spend doesn't always equal great security.
Yeah.
You can have people spending money in all funny kind of ways. And I know that sometimes a response to a big breach is just to double the budget of security. You always, I think, security, I mean, boards should always be looking at where are we spending and does our spend match the risk profile, and is it going to mean that we diminish the risk in that area? And I think, again, getting back to my dashboards and distractions, often you can see that people are really excited when they visit other countries and see things they can bring home. And again, does that actually equate to minimising risk, security risk? So you can get lots of spend, but in all the wrong places, or perhaps possibly not all the best places to drive down the risk. And it can, again, you know, are you going to a framework that is driving down the risk, or is it that you're pouring spend into legacy platforms that are really expensive to try and patch and maintain? So it could be some of that. And I think the thing I didn't appreciate, not being a technical person, is all the platforms, and often in large organisations, the kit that is actually running is expensive, and even changing out your operations centre or things you want to have feed in is a 3 to 4 year cycle, and it's all got to match in. So it's not a matter of, it's like Lego blocks, they've all got to match in, and it takes years to get it all right. So that's a lot of money, and a lot of money moving around when you only have 3 year cycles, obviously, usually for budget. So it's just pivot. It's like turning the Titanic. It takes a long time to do, and is something you have to really consider.